We're going to talk about
What are we going to talk about?
parapsychology today.
Oh,
This idea of being able to read biomagnetism and the study of telepathy, and just how far back this is of interest to those that have the money and the resources to do this kind of research. So notes are out in chat. If you're not in chat, go to PATRIOT'S.com. And when you get there, you will find a location that says shows. And when you go to shows, you will find a banner that looks like this. It says Big Tech. And if you get to that page, you will find a section that says read, watch, think for yourself. And the notes are there, Big Tech notes and the archives. We are on episode 78. And I threw this together today. So we are going to explore some of this together in real time. And it's really, really remarkable that this came across my plate today. I looked on Twitter, and someone who honestly is an anti-Trumper retweeted or liked something that I had submitted on Twitter, I think back in April, and I hadn't seen it since. And it was related to this idea of psychotronics or parapsychology. So we're gonna look at some of this stuff, and we'll start here. The USSR spent $1 billion, 1 billion with a B, on mind control programs, and this was posted December 28th, 2013. So we're going to read this and kind of set the table. There's two of these articles, and then we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive. The race to put a man on the moon was enough of a battle for global superpowers during the Cold War. At the time, the Soviet Union and the United States were in an arms race of a bizarre, unconventional kind that has been exposed in a new report. Beginning in 1917 and continuing until 2003, the Soviets poured up to $1 billion into developing mind-controlling weaponry to compete with similar programs undertaken in the United States. While much still remains classified, we can now confirm the Soviets used methods to manipulate test subjects' brains. The paper by Sergei Kernebach at the Research Center of Advanced Robotics and Environmental Science in Stuttgart, Germany, details the Soviet Union's extensive experiments called psychotronics. The paper is based on Russian technical journals and recently declassified documents. The paper outlines how the Soviets developed Serpan, a device to generate and store high-frequency electromagnetic radiation, which was used to affect other objects. If the generator is designed properly, it is able to accumulate bioenergy from all living things, animals, plants, humans, and then release it outside, the paper said. This drawing you see here is a schematic made by Soviet scientists detailing the biocircuitry of the human nervous system. And you can see here you have what look like load coils or types of coils, and capacitors and resistors and all of these things that equate to electrical or electronics, and they are mapping or mirroring what the nervous system responds like, or is similar to as it relates to electronic circuits. The psychotronics program, known in the US as parapsychology, involves unconventional research into mind control and remote influence, and was funded by the government. With only limited knowledge of each other's mind-bending programs, the Soviets and the Americans were both participating in similar secret operations with areas of interest often mirroring the other country's study. The psychotronics projects draws similarities to part of the controversial program MKUltra in the United States. The CIA program ran for 20 years and has been highly documented since being investigated in the 1970s, and was recently dramatized in the 2009 movie, The Men Who Stare at Goats. Scientists involved in the MKUltra program researched the probability of manipulating people's minds by altering their brain functions using electromagnetic waves. This program led to the development of psychotronic weapons. which were intended to be used to perform these mind-shifting functions. The illegal research subjected humans to experiments with drugs such as LSD, hypnosis, and radiological and biological agents. Shockingly, some studies were conducted without the participants' knowledge. Kernebach's paper on the Soviet Union's psychotronics program fails to mention one thing: the results. He also doesn't detail whether there are ongoing mind control programs in the US or Russia, but there are suspicions. Russian President Vladimir Putin made mention of futuristic weaponry last year in a presidential campaign article. Space-based systems and IT tools, especially in cyberspace, will play a great, if not decisive, role in armed conflicts. In a more remote future, weapon systems that use different physical principles will be created: beam, geophysical, wave, genetic, psychophysical, and other types of weapons. Weapons, genetic weapons, wave-based weapons, beam weapons, geophysical weapons, psychophysical weapons, cyber weapons. All this will provide fundamentally new instruments for achieving political and strategic goals, in addition to nuclear weapons, he wrote. The newly declassified information outlined in the report only touches on Soviet psychotronics program, on the Soviet psychotronics program, and the bizarre experiments undertaken. With so much information still classified, will we ever know the whole truth? So there's links in this article, should you choose to review this for yourself in the notes. I did not check this link out, so we'll look and see what it says here. Unconventional research in the USSR and Russia, the short overview. I'll add this into the notes when we're done here. This work briefly surveys unconventional research in Russia from the end of the 19th until the beginning of the 21st centuries in the areas related to the generation and detection of high penetrating emission of non-biological origin. The overview is based on open scientific journalistic materials. The unique character of this research and its history originating from the government programs of the USSR is shown. Relations to modern studies on biological effects of weak electromagnetic emission, several areas of bioinformatics, and theories of physical vacuum are discussed. In the USSR and Russia from about 1921 up until now, many different research activities denoted today as unconventional have been conducted. For instance, these are related to the impact of weak and strong electromagnetic emission on biological objects, quantum entanglement in macroscopic systems, non-logical signal transmission based on the Aharonov-Bohm effect, human operator phenomena, and others. This research, especially after the 80s, was very broad. It dealt with several boundary areas of psychology on one side and touched theoretical physics on the other side. Since the USSR had in fact no unsupported by government research, unlike Europe and USA, where such research can be supported by private funds, all these activities can be interpreted as government programs. Single scientists such as A.L. Chevinsky and N.A. Karev or N.I. Kobosev, who worked outside state programs, encountered substantial difficulties and were almost unknown in their time. Several such governmental programs are not officially published until now. For instance, documents on experiments performed in OGPU and NKVD, even 80 years after, still remain classified. Information about these works originates mainly from indirect sources, such as interviews of participating persons, solitary scientific popular publications. So let's scan this real quick. Yeah, I have this document actually in another location. I believe it's here, as a matter of fact. Yep. Well, cool. So they posted both of these in this New York Post article. So we're just going to continue and we'll come back to that in a minute. This was a link in that New York Post article as well. It's from medium.com, revealed the Soviet Union's $1 billion psychotronic arms race with the US. And we read most of this, but it does give a little bit extra or different information. It's just written a different way. And so these articles basically mirror each other. But the reason I included it was because it had this link here, this ARXIV link. And this took me to Cornell University, where they posted unconventional research in the USSR and Russia, a short overview, which is what we were just looking at briefly a minute ago. And so we will continue with this reading here, and we're going to just get down into the meat of it. We don't need the rest of the preface. Basically, what this is saying is that information was released or discovered, however you want to look at that. It was compiled and put into various publications, and this is one of them. And so this was posted 5 December 2013 is when it was loaded into this particular file storage system, the arxiv.org. So before 1917, we're going to go back in time up until now, right? What we're skipping here, what I want to read, I'm not going to read it, but what we're skipping here is this generalized history of then until now. And really what I got out of this was that this was an intensive field of study up until right around World War II. And then it was basically labeled as pseudoscience. And the people who were outwardly speaking about it were basically imprisoned, their reputations defamed. And this study went underground. And Russia's not the only country, right? The United States is not the only country. Europe, meaning the larger concept of Europe, the European continent. This is ongoing research in many, many countries, but the Russian research has most of the public information that I've been able to find so far. So we're going to read about the Russian released information. Before 1917, the first official contact between the Russian science and phenomena denoted today generally as paranormal occurred in the 70s of the 19th century. The commission headed by Professor D.I. Mendeleev investigated the phenomena of spiritualism. The commission included, among others, Professor A.M. Butlerov and Professor N.P. Wagner, who believed in the existence of these phenomena, spiritualism. The traces of the work of this commission can be found in the correspondence between the Russian and German scientists, and even in the works of H.P. Blavatsky. The conclusion of the commission in 1876, spiritualistic phenomena occur on the unconscious movements or the conscious deception. The spiritualistic doctrine is superstition. Despite the commission denying these phenomena, many questions remained open. Taking into account books and periodic publications of A.M. Butlerov, it can be assumed that further discussions was sharply polarized. This polarity in the acceptance and rejection of research, touching even indirectly on any paranormal phenomena, is characteristic of all future Russian and Soviet studies. To explain the phenomenon of mental suggestion, Butlerov hypothesized, Freudian slip, that the nervous system and the brain are a source of specific radiation. By analogy, the movement of the nerve currents in the body is similar to electric currents in conductors, shown in Figure 1. Transmission of the signals from the brain of one person to another one occurs due to the electroinductive effect. Despite this assumption sounding naive from today's point of view, this attitude was typical for the late 19th century. We're talking about the 1800s. It was primarily motivated by developments of radio at the time, where many researchers tried to find radio waves also in the psychic area. For example, W. Crookes assumed the human brain is capable of sending and receiving some sort of electromagnetic rays at very high frequency. Very interesting, right? This correlation between radio waves and electromagnetic emissions from the brain. A similar view was shared also by Albert Abrams, whose work led to the emergence of radionics in the USA. However, Russian engineering works, despite a similar start in the 19th century, evolved in a different direction, as will be shown later. Vitalistic theories also had their own development in Russia. For example, the famous psychiatrist Y.L. Ultrovich, since 1867, developed magnetic hypnotic therapy based on the theory of animal magnetism. Following Ultrovich, all living organisms emit a particular magnetic field, which is of organic origin. In 1910 to 1912, he lectured on this subject and even was awarded by the Paris Academy of Sciences. Ultrovich's great merit in the pursuit of interdisciplinary works on the study in these phenomena. It should be mentioned that Y. Ulrich has devoted many years to study the phenomena of telepathy and mediumship. After a series of experiments with well-known medium E. Palladino, the scientists came to the conclusion that these are manifestations of an organic energy of the medium, which can be investigated by experimental methods. The result of his research was a 5-volume work, Mediumistic Phenomena, in his book, The Secret Knowledge in Egypt, which complements even the modern Egyptology. Y. Ulrich argues that paranormal phenomena, being physical, consist in the transmission of lower-level energy, which are, however, measurable by technical means. And I believe this is figure 1 here. It is. This is a picture of a paper. And you see here up in it's 1911, I think, is the year. And this is written in Russian. And they've got this picture here. It looks like it's some type of a measurement type device indicating that they're trying to understand the brain or read what's coming out of the brain. And here you have what looks like 2 brains that have a communications link. Figure 1, paper of Barchenko on mental suggestion and a distant transfer of thoughts, published in 1911. A. Barchenko was known from the Soviet OGPU programs in 1912 through 1937. We're going to spend some time on these ideas for the next few shows. So I encourage you to pay attention and participate as much as you can in chat. The idea here is to stimulate conversation and to get your minds thinking and understanding that these ideas have been around, and the manifestation and or perfection of these ideas and techniques have been around for well over 100 years. And I really, really think that we need to go through this in detail so that when we start talking about antennas and we start talking about modern electromagnetic systems, these ideas exist, so that we can start making parallels and associations as it relates to just how nearby these systems, these modern systems are. So it can be assumed that between the Commission's report in 1876 and the Revolution of 1917, I've heard that number before, there was an interest in the study of mental phenomena by means of physiological research. It was driven by a scientific community, not only in Russia, but also abroad. For example, in 1890, the Russian Society of Experimental Psychology formed a commission to study the phenomenon of mind reading in 1890. In 1907, it published the works of the first All-Russian Congress of Spiritualists. In 1907, by decree of Emperor Nicholas II, the St. Petersburg Research Institute of Neuropsychiatrics was founded. This is before World War I, folks. Its founder was V.M. Betchtrev. St. Petersburg's Institute was one of the main centers where unconventional studies were later conducted. Betchtrev's works before 1917 are related to various aspects of mental suggestion. In view of all what has been said, it is impossible not to agree with the fact that hysteria and spoilage largely owe their origin to the side of home life of Russian people. It is obvious that peculiar superstitions and religious beliefs of people give a psychic coloring to the disease state, which is shown under the name of spoilage, hysterics, and possession. The question of the development of these diseases in our nation is deeply interesting. In this respect, it plays apparently a huge role in voluntary suggestion, experienced by individuals under different conditions. It's interesting that the way they write and speak then versus now, it's very different. Anyway, to summarize, the period before 1917, it should be noted that a well-known school of mental suggestion was formed in Russia. Here, some vitalistic works and original psychological developments can be found. On the technological side, there is a tendency to explain these phenomenon with the help of electromagnetism, which is typical for that time. In performed experiments, we observed an attempt to measure these mental effects. Due to extensive contacts between Russian and European researchers, there was a similar formulation of problems and experimental methodology. In subsequent periods, the number of scientific communications was dramatically reduced, and the topics of Russian works increasingly took a specific character, which was subsequently referred to as the Soviet program. The period between 1917 and 1937, so now we're looking at World War I up to basically the beginnings of World War II. The period after 1917 is primarily related to the October Revolution. The October Revolution. As we will see, the unconventional research in Russia is characterized by a periodical movement from broad support to almost total closing. The first such period began in 1917 through 1918. Organizations not supported by the new regime were closed. This was especially related to Masonic and spiritualistic movements. I'm just going to let this sink in for a minute here. So we've got the period after 1917 being known as the October Revolution. You have a purge of science, and they're speaking specifically to parapsychology, basically, bioenergetics, electromagnetism, as it relates to what we're just reading, right? Between 1917 and 1918. And they're stating here that in their summation, this was due or related to Masonic and spiritualistic movements. So we'll continue. The parapsychological journals, Rebus, published since 1881, was closed. There appeared a new scientific system where scientists also played some roles in relevant government agencies. For example, Betchtrev was a member of the Academic Council at the Commissariat Ministry of Education. It can be assumed that a more or less coordinated Soviet program began in 1924, when the Commissioner, Minister of Education, A.V. Lunachinsky, formed the Russian Committee for Psychical Research at the International Committee of the Psychical Research. Many authors point to a program of the USSR's Commissar of Defense in 1932 to 1937 related to transfer of information in a biological way. We're talking about information transfer using biology. These works were conducted in two places, in Leningrad at the Bechstev's Brain Institute, led by Professor L.L. Vasilev, and in Moscow at the Laboratory of Biophysics, Academy of Science, led by Professor P.P. Lazarev and Professor S.Y. Churligin. The Biophysics Laboratory was asked to investigate the physical nature of telepathy. This is basically 100 years ago, folks. For instance, in Moscow's laboratory, the first results of biological emission from humans were obtained. In Leningrad, the Brain Institute was requested to perform more psychologically oriented works, such as transferring visual images and remotely influencing the percipient. Both research organizations did not know about the works of each other. Sounds kind of like DARPA a little bit, only back in the day. The book by B.B. Kazulinski, I think, points to works of A.V. Lentovich, L.L. Vasilev, V.M. Bechstev, P.P. Lazarev, which are related to electrophysiology and were made between 1916 and 1921. Thus, in the 20s, there were various groups of researchers both in Leningrad and Moscow. The fundamental works of B.B. Kaczynski and A.V. Lentovich and Vasilev and Bechstev focused on the effect of suggestion and signal transmission in a biological way. See Figure 2 for example experiments with animals performed by Lev Durov. So here's this image again, right? Original scheme of transmitting and receiving biocircuitry of the human nervous system. It was already clear in 1927 that electromagnetism does not explain the nature of telepathy. Chambers, a Faraday cage, were made of metal. The subjects were first placed in the chambers. Then the experiments were conducted outside the chambers. There was no difference. The phenomenon of telepathy manifested equally in the chamber and outside it. It turned out that the iron walls of the chambers were not a barrier to telepathic radiation. Well, then it's not radio waves. Since these experiments, the telepathic radiation is denoted as high penetrating and non-electromagnetic. However, the works within EM emission have shown that mechanisms of higher nervous activity can be affected by technical means, in particular by microwave radiation. Nervous system can be affected by technical means, in particular microwave radiation. Microwaves. So we're talking about AM, FM radio. We're talking about your wireless home phones, 900 megahertz stuff. We're talking about digital broadcast TV. We're talking about Wi-Fi. We're talking about Bluetooth. We're talking about Zigbee. We're talking about mobile cellular communications. And we haven't even started on 5G yet. In this context, the effects discovered by B.G. Makalitsky can be mentioned. It is about the impact of medium, short, EM waves modulated by low frequency signals on separate areas of the brain. You have electromagnetic waves that are modulated by low frequency signals. So when we look at, we're going to pause here. I'm going to explain this for a second. What this means is that you have a carrier wave. So your cell phone or a Bluetooth signal, right? Let's just take Bluetooth, for example. It's 2.4 gigahertz and it's channelized. So there's many channels for a Bluetooth signal to work. 2.4 gigahertz. That's just the carrier wave. So it's going to transmit at 2.4 gigahertz. Well, they can overlay other signals on top of it. And that's what they're talking about. It's the way that the carrier frequency is modulated. And that's why they use that term, modulated. It's about the impact of medium or short electromagnetic waves modulated by low frequency signals on separate areas of the brain, which are responsible for emotional state and functionality of different organs. So now they're basically tying in the fact that electromagnetic waves, microwaves, when modulated with low frequency signals, when placed into an organism, particularly the brain, are responsible for an emotional state or functionality of different organs. Turreglin, in the introduction to his work, described the biological effects of electromagnetic radiation. Keep in mind, folks, this is in the 20s. 1920s. Various biological effects can be explained by unequal absorption of microwave energy by different tissues in the body. This has to do with their dielectric variations, their permeability variations. There are patents for that. We will go over it as time goes on when we go back and look at how electromagnetics are used to image the body. There are plenty of patents to show that what is just been stated here is actually true, and they use it in medicine today. Various biological effects can be explained by unequal absorption of microwave energy by different tissues of the body, as well as by an excitation of some parts of the nervous system. This method is new and apparently powerful enough to estimate this absorption of electromagnetic energy from both qualitative and quantitative sides. Indeed, if the absorption of electromagnetic energy takes place in nerves and nerve cells, a negligible portion of the energy absorbed by the nerve is enough to produce a number of secondary phenomena in the body caused by the excitation of the nerve. Now we're talking about nervous system manipulation due to the absorption of electromagnetic energy in a non-uniform way, which means that they can be studied and quantified, as they state here, both qualitative and quantitatively understood, whereby you can create reproducible effects of this nervous system manipulation. Moving on. It is essential that such secondary processes occur due to a comparatively high internal energy of the body. For example, due to the energy of tissues, which are innervated by the modified nerve in our experiments, but not due to a relatively insignificant absorbed external energy by the nerve. Thus, all parts of the electromagnetic spectrum contain some bands which act differently on biological objects, in particular on the nervous system of a living organism. The search for radiation emitted by organisms represents the second way of finding biologically active waves and of clarifying the issues of absorption of the electromagnetic field. If the experiment confirms the existence of an active emitting of electromagnetic waves by a living organism, it is necessary to clarify the biological significance of it. So I'm going to restate this. When they run an experiment and they confirm, right? When they confirm the existence of an active emission of an electromagnetic wave by a living organism, so they're testing, probing, and they're understanding an emission of that's coming off of something that's alive, like a human. then they're stating that it's necessary to clarify the biological significance of it. So where is it coming from? Why is it being emitted? What's going on with the human or the animal that matches up with this electromagnetic signature that we're reading? That's what they're trying to quantify or encapsulate here. Since it is no matter how small of the intensity, so what they're saying here is it doesn't matter if it's a large emission or a very, very weak emission. The idea is to understand what the emission represents, what's going on with the biological organism. What can they interpret from that electromagnetic wave emission? This is back in like the 1920s. It can be one of the strongest factors in the daily life of living organisms. Thus, Chiriglin confirms the orientation and the subject of the Soviet pre-war program. This program, as it is followed from open publications, focused on problems of information transfer and their practical applications for biological objects. It must be said that similar works were carried out in other countries. See example, the Book of Kaczynski. For example, the well-known experiments were made by Ferdinando Casamali in Italy for the detection of meter and centimeter electromagnetic waves emitted by the brain during increased mental activity. Meter and centimeter electromagnetic waves. So we're talking about kilohertz and megahertz. That's what we're talking about when you look at the electromagnetic spectrum. Meter long waves, multi-meter long waves, right? Many meters being one wavelength, and centimeter waves, which go all the way up to modern wireless communications, 2.4 gigahertz, for example. 2.4 gigahertz is about, I believe it's 12 centimeters for one wavelength. Let's pause for a second and have a look, shall we? So we will 1 meter wave length. Wavelength calculator. Let's see. Let's do this one. Wave frequency. So let's do 12 kilohertz. I'm not liking this one. Hang on. I don't want to take the time to sit and try to interpret it. Here, this one might be better. It's already made. Yeah. Much better. All right. So 1 megahertz is 300 meters. 10 megahertz is 30 meters. 50 megahertz is 6 meters. 1 meter is 300 megahertz. When we get up into television and radio broadcasts, right? Digital television, let's just go there. Digital television and cell towers, right? We're looking at half meter wavelengths. And then we move into centimeters. 900 megahertz, one wavelength, one wave cycle, top to bottom, back to top again, crest, trough to crest. If you think of it like a somebody doing the wave in front of you, right, with their hand. Top to bottom, back to top again. 900 megahertz is 33 centimeters. 2.5 gigahertz is 12 centimeters. So I was very close with that. So just keep that in mind when they're talking about the electromagnetic emissions coming out of the brain during heightened mental activity. Ranges from meters to centimeters. And even at 10 gigahertz, we're still in the centimeter range. Millimeters Won't even tell us here. Millimeters go higher up. That's cool. I'm going to save this chart, as a matter of fact. This is a very good chart because they talk about quarter wavelength and 1/20th wavelength and all these things. And what they can do is they can miniaturize antennas. And if they use a specific ratio of the wavelength, all they have to do is modify the power, so to speak, or tune it, and they can pick up these frequencies. So this is actually a pretty cool looking chart. We'll go back. So well-known experiments in Italy, Casomali, for the detection of meter and centimeter electromagnetic waves emitted by the brain. As it can also be seen from the publishers of this book, Research Laboratory of the U.S. Army, Fort Belvoir, this research was also pursued in other countries. The role of special services in shaping the USSR unconventional program should be mentioned separately. Apparently, the OGPU NKVD was interested in the possibilities of this technology. As an example, the name of A. Barchenko can be indicated. In 1921, he organized an expedition to the Kola Peninsula on Bekhtechev's orders. Another Barchenko's expedition to Crimea was financed by the OGPU and was related to the chief of Special Department K. Bukia. Some sources mentioned the existence of several special laboratories. For example, one of them, Neuroenergetic Laboratory at the Special Department of the OGPU, was initially with the Moscow Power Engineering Institute after 1934, in the building of the Institute of Experimental Medicine. Now, I'm reading these things right now, and I'm reading these more or less for the first time. I browsed this, but did not read it with this level of detail. And I'm kind of getting creeped out because I see American equivalents, not saying this is going on, but when I see Moscow Power Engineering Institute, I think Department of Energy. I think national laboratories, that kind of stuff, right? And the Institute of Experimental Medicine, well, just let your imagination go as it relates to what possibly could be done in a communist, totalitarian type of an environment with an Institute of Experimental Medicine. The name of Barchenko's work is very characteristic. Introduction to the Methodology of Experimental Influence of Volumetric Energy Fields. Introduction to the Methodology of Experimental Influence of Volumetric Energy Fields. So that means that you're emitting an energy field in 3 dimensions, creating like a metaphorical cloud or a bubble, a sphere, if you will. Not a circle, but a sphere of energy, and then putting biologics in it and watching what happens. Unfortunately, the text of the work is not available. Funding of some Barchenko's projects was apparently performed on personal instructions of F. Dzerzhinsky. Due to the fact that Barchenko's documents are still classified, we can only guess what was happening in his laboratory. Barchenko undertook repeated attempts to organize an expedition to Tibet, made a trip to the caves of the Crimea, bare corners of the Kostroma region, the Altai, where many occult objects were collected. The scientist was a consultant during investigations of all kinds of healers, shamans, psychics, and hypnotists to test these human anomalies. Bukia's department equipped a special black room. The pre-war research was performed within a narrow program supervised by the state. Single researchers, even if they obtained interesting results in this area, were strongly persecuted. I'm going to pause for a minute here. Single researchers, even if they obtained interesting results in this area, were strongly persecuted. What that means is if any of this research was conducted without being sanctioned by the government, those individuals were persecuted, whether or not they came up with anything interesting or otherwise. In this context, the name of A.L. Shavinsky can be mentioned. Despite Shavinsky collaborated with Bechterev and Kaczynski in Jurov's zoophysiological laboratory. I'm assuming that's for animals. His fate is different. In the years 1930 to 1936, he expressed an interesting theory about unknown Z-rays in sun emission. These rays are presumably of non-electromagnetic nature, possess a high penetrating character, and interact with biological organisms. The standard test for erythrocyte sedimentation under the influence of high penetrating emission has also been developed by Stravinsky. He invented the so-called Stravinsky chandelier in the 30s, which has an effect of aeronization. See figure 3. As it revealed later, this device is also a generator of high penetrating emission, whose design is similar to another generator, the so-called Vienix coronal generator of the 90s. So this is a high voltage applied to this object to create the aeronization effect. That looks kind of Tesla-ish to me, in my view. Stravinsky's Z-rays can be related to the works of N.P. Mishkin, who introduced the pondomotor forces of light field and also have a high penetrating character. In connection with Stravinsky, it needs to mention the name K.E. Zailovsky, who was also a supporter of cosmism and whose philosophic and ethic works had been classified for a long time after his death. As indicated by many sources, all these studies and programs were partially collapsed in 1937. Some of the researchers and their families were repressed. Barchenko, Bokia, as well as some members of Royarik's Central Asian expedition were shot. In 1936, Stravinsky was dismissed as incompetent, and in 1942, he was arrested for counter-revolutionary activities and exiled. So they're providing examples of this type of persecution. All research results and manuscripts were classified. Only S.J. Churiglin published abridged results of his research in the field of human microwave radiation in the early 40s. Closing programs for almost 20 years indicated the first cycle in the development of unconventional research, and also several more general areas of parapsychology in the USSR. Due to the tightening of the totalitarian regime, war, and ideological differences, several Western works have been overlooked and remained almost unknown in the USSR. For example, in the field of radionics, screw effects, and instrumental parapsychology. These works also dealt with high penetrating emissions, but from different points of view. For example, the idea of subtle field resonances, which is characteristic for radionics, has not found its way into the Soviet Union, at least until the 60s and the 70s. This is also related to the strange non-biological radiation detected by Stravinsky and Mishkin, which was also found in the West. For example, in the works of Thomas Hieronymus, including radiation from celestial bodies, and Victor Schauberger. Further Soviet works at the end of the 50s and early 60s began with repeating experimental results made prior to 1937. So what they're indicating here is that based on what they've been able to find, the research that's been released, there was basically a 20-year hiatus. The period from 1955 until 1980. So now we're getting to a period where we're all alive. Many sources indicate that the post-war Soviet works began with the study of Germany's Anaribe archives, removed from the castle Atlan. We cannot say whether this is true or not. On one hand, these sources claim the documents have not been worked out in the 60s, only later in the 80s and the 90s. In publications of that period, we cannot detect any significant breakthrough in the field of unconventional research. However, on the other hand, it is indicated that German NS specialists were involved in the US programs such as MK Ultra. In the Soviet Union, the question of continuing unconventional research was raised by the president of the USSR's Academy of Science in 1961, which was resolved positively. It can be assumed that the documents from Anarabi Archive were known to Soviet top leaders, and to some extent, they stimulated extensive studies in the 60s and the 70s. The research in this period was split into a few areas. First of all, the classic parapsychological experiments with a variety of phenomena exhibited by psychics were continued. Second, the program on the influence of electromagnetic radiation on biological objects received essential attention. It received essential attention. This is the largest program with many sub-branches and funding, which eventually led to the emergence of the psychotronic weapons discussed in the media. Both the first and second programs had open and closed parts. And third, a new direction related to the high penetrating emission of non-biological nature was founded. In this review, we pay more attention to this research. Let us return to the work of S.Y. Churlian, described in, looks like, citation 2 and 40, and partly in citation 42. Churlian was a well-known expert in the field of high-frequency electromagnetic emission. Thus, he possessed an excellent understanding of the subject of experiments. The structure of one of Churlian's experiment is shown in figure 4. And so what you have here is a lead chamber. You have a source of a human emission, so a human inside a lead box, and a pipe, which is basically a waveguide, and then a biological sensor, another human, or a biological sensor that is designed to pick up human emissions. And it says here, lead screen, rubber copper mirror, diffraction grating, an electronic capacitor, an electric capacitor. And that's interesting because, we're going to get into fringe fields as it relates to proximity sensors, but that's kind of what makes those things our capacitors. And those are also used to pick up biologic signals in modern day safety sensors that they're putting in cars now to evaluate your mental health while you're driving. We'll get to that. There's a whole block on that. That's probably going to be discussed when we start talking about antennas. So back to this document. We will quote from citation 2. Among used removable devices that supply a pipe was a lead screen, which should presumably delay a radiation. This radiation should also meet a hard rubber or copper mirror intended to reflect the radiation flux, which is just a way of saying radiation change. By passing through the grating, it must demonstrate a diffraction pattern. So they're trying to disperse or diffract, change or manipulate the electromagnetic wave by making it pass through a grating. So just like a bunch of, think a chicken wire being like grating, right? The highs and the lows of the energy. So they want to create a diffraction pattern of the highs and lows of the energy density. In some cases, the alleged flow of radiation can pass between the plates of a capacitor. After going through a particular plug-in device which transformed it, the radiation reached the test person. Thus, the study was intended to clarify a purely physical picture of the phenomena, and the test person has served as a bioindicator, the hypnotist, as a biogenerator of radiation. So what we're really reading here in slow-mo are rudimentary experiments of human-to-human interaction as it relates to paranormal, a hypnotist, a shaman, something like that, right? A psychic. And trying to read and understand the energy transfers between those types of individuals and just another person, trying to be able to pick up those emissions, those electromagnetic signals. Analysis and summary of the results given or gave Cherglin a weighty reason to come to the conclusion that the lead shields holds the radiation. This was manifested by increasing time until the test person fell down in comparison with experiments in which the screen was not used. The experiments with mirrors confirmed the presence of radiation and optical law of its reflection. Experiments with a diffraction grating allowed to determine the wavelength of the radiation. It was in the range of 1.8 to 2.1 millimeters. However, the electric field of the capacitor does not deviate the radiation. So it makes sense what they did. They isolated the individuals, put a tube in between, and then started adding and removing these different things, right, to see what influenced the electromagnetism that they were picking up on, that they were able to read. Some concluding Cherglin's remarks are interesting. He wrote, from the viewpoint of physics, the most significant fact is the behavior of the test person. The duration of the exposure, gave a clear optical picture, which can be explained only by the presence of radiant energy. He continues, these experiments do not leave us in doubt about the presence of radiation emanating from the human body. According to him, he came to the conclusion that some of the properties and parameters of recorded radiation differ from electromagnetic radiation. For example, it does not deviate in the electric field of the capacitor. So what he's getting at is that whatever is radiating from humans is not exclusively electromagnetic. There are other energetic emissions. This work is extremely important as it establishes the possibility of physical manipulation with biological radiation. I'm going to read that again. This work is extremely important as it establishes the possibility of physical manipulation with biological radiation. Thus, Cherglin's work in the 30s are very close with the works of Hieronymus, also in the 30s. Hieronymus also found that specific radionic radiation has some properties of electrical and optical radiation. However, as we said in the previous section, neither Hieronymus nor Cherglin knew about each other. After the war in 1952, Cherglin created a series of telepathic experiments. 1952, this guy is creating telepathic experiments with G.G. Mirza, and opened a laboratory for the study of parapsychology in 1955. After the death of Cherglin in 1958, D.G. Mirza became the head of the laboratory. Interestingly, the question about continuing the research in this laboratory was decided not only by the Institute of Biophysics, but most likely splashed in the Academy of Sciences. However, in 1958, no specific decisions or activities followed from this side. The next phase of research begins in the 60s, as indicated by citation 8. In 1961, a special meeting at the president of the USSR's Academy of Sciences academician M.K. Keldysh considered the question about the laboratory led by D.G. Mirza. Academician Astrayan, Berg, Yazarberov, Mins, Tam, Karnashev also attended the meeting. The question about the laboratory was resolved positively. Apparently, 1961 represents the beginning of a new program. Since after 1961, the books of Kaczynski and Vasilev, 1963 new edition from 1959 appeared. So they made revisions to whatever the writings were prior to that time, is what they're saying here. They contained results from the 30s and provided the first look into Soviet pre-war research. In the USSR, since the parapsychology belonged to the category of the Borgias mysticism, the publication of these books has meant to state gave a green light for starting works in this area. Another hypothesis about 1960 as the start of the new program is expressed in citation 1. The Minister of Defense, R.J. Malinsky, received documents in 1960 about the U.S. attempts to use telepathy in military purposes. Although these publications appeared later as unserious, they triggered the USSR and in turn the USA to new military programs. Further development of this Soviet program, in particular in Marine, is related to many names. Example, G.A. Sergeyev. He worked at the time in the Popov Higher Naval Academy of Radio Electronics, so they're Navy basically, in the field of hydroacoustics. Surprisingly, we found a number of his patents from 1964, which dealt with the measurement of biological potentials, in particular the EEG, the electroencephalography. This would confirm the hypothesis of starting military programs after 1961. EEG are used to measure brain activities, also in Parov's experiments with rabbits. Thus, in 1961, the Soviet unconventional research received new impulses. A number of separate programs, both in open and closed areas, were started, performed sometime by the same organization and researchers. Parapsychological works based on publications of Vassiliev and Plekhanov. It can be argued that the orientation of research on biophysical fields and information transfer remained the same. We can give some examples of studies in the 60s. In 1963, Vassiliev, together with the Bekhtcherev's Brain Institute, conducted successful sessions of telepathic communication between Leningrad and Sevastopol. In 1963, these cats are claiming that they conducted successful sessions of telepathic communication. Whoa. Between Leningrad and Sevastopol. They repeated results of such experiments from the 30s. This was one of the first works intended to replicate experimental data. In 1965 through 1967, the group led by Parov held telepathic experiments on rabbits, which had implanted electrodes in the lateral nucleus of the anterior hypothalamus. Rabbit inductors and rabbit percipients were removed from each other on the distance of 7 kilometers, so miles and miles away. The behavioral responses of rabbit percipients in relation to rabbit inductors stimulated by 1.5 to 2.5 volt signal were investigated. A series of 36 experiments have been carried out, which included 535 cycles. As pointed out by Parov, the number of matches is well over a half of the total number of cycles. The probability of obtaining these results randomly determined by the significant level is very low. So they're saying that the idea of the random nature of this is very, very low, which means they're reaching conclusive results in their opinion, which gives reason to accept the hypothesis of the existence of connection between rabbits distant from each other at distances of up to 7 kilometers. As claimed in citation 1, these rabbits were used as a system of biological communication in marine experiments, in particular with submarines. From the 60s, different academic institutes started the study of such phenomena as the dermo-optical perception of Rosa Kuleshova, and later in the 70s, the telekinesis of Nina Kulagina. In 1969, a studio of science documentary films created the first movie about Nina Kulagina and her abilities. The film marked the beginning of filmmaking about parapsychological research. In the US, the report, Defense Intelligence Agency document, Controlled Offensive Behavior, the USSR, and we will look at this document. Controlled Offensive Behavior, put out by the USSR. July 1972, it is stated that in 1967, the USSR had more than 20 centers for the study of paranormal phenomena with a budget of $21 million. One of the most important points in the early 70s is the special commission established by the order of Dmitriev, the secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. The commission was requested to investigate psychic phenomenon and to provide a scientific conclusion to Soviet leaders. Between the meeting in the Academy of Sciences and this commission was about 10 years. During that time, a sufficient amount of experimental results were collected to enable the assessment by the commission. This again points to the intensity of the work in the 60s. The commission recognized the reality of psychic phenomena. The report was published in 1973. 1 year later, it was translated into several languages, including English, German, French, and Italian. Zinachenko, one of the members of the commission, said about the report, "The main thing, we were able to articulate and to defend a principal point. The phenomenon exists. The communication channel is unknown. The affecting channel is unknown. Fans can look for." The commission's work is the basis for the assumption that the interest of the Central Committee of the CPSU for Biological Radiation and Paranormal Humans Abilities, which was the focus of the commission, appeared only in the first half of the 70s. This coincides with the early psychotronic movement and first symposiums in 1970 and 1973. Psychotronics, folks. Symposiums, meaning you have mass gatherings of very, very smart people to talk about psychotronics. As well as with public information about US programs, it is likely that both countries have used each other in the arguments in favor of such studies and the struggle for funding. For instance, the Soviet representative in the International Association for the Study of Psychotronics was Professor Samilov from the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Impact of electromagnetic fields on biologic objects. Next section. The idea about the electromagnetic nature of biological radiation was rejected already in the 20s and 30s. However, studies on the impact of electromagnetic radiation on biological objects were continued and enlarged following the work of Mikhailovinsky and others from the 30s. It was found that the electromagnetic field with certain parameters can cause a variety of biophysical and mental effects. This is back in the 30s. It can be assumed that the psychophysiological effects of microwave emissions were actively investigated during the NS regime in Germany. And after 1945, the technology was adopted by the country's winners. According to another version, the first mentioning of the fact that pulse modulated electromagnetic radiation can cause auditory hallucinations was in 1956. And that, folks, is how modern wireless communications work. Pulse modulation. Anyway, already in the 50s, the USSR and the USA had their own programs on studying the impact of electromagnetic fields on biological objects. In 1953, the USA started the program MKUltra, the CIA program in which, according to the US Supreme Court, about 80 institutions, including 44 universities, 12 hospitals, 3 prisons, and 185 private researchers participated. As mentioned in the public documents, the program to some extent was motivated by the corresponding NKVD program, with similar strategies of using psychotropic drugs, right? Psychotropic substances and technical equipment. And it looks like here, document listed as secret that is probably now declassified. What it says about this document, because it's difficult to read. And what they're stating here is a note on the possible connection between methods to influence objects from Project MKUltra with Soviet works from the 30s. According to some authors, several German physicians with experience from NS concentration camps were involved into MKUltra. This supports the hypothesis about works by Hitler's Germany in the field of psychotronics and the role of Anirby documents in Soviet programs. In the mid-1970s, the program drew public attention in 2011. In 2011, some of these documents were declassified. Part of MKUltra program was also devoted to the influence of electromagnetic fields on human physiological and psychological conditions. I'm gonna let that lie for now, but just understand that all this stuff we hear about MKUltra and this idea of shock therapy and forced drugging, they didn't really disclose almost anything about what they did as it relates to electromagnetic fields and how those things affect human physiology and human psychology. Very difficult to find. You can find lots about chemicals. You can find lots about electrical contact or electrodes placed into things like animals. You find a lot about that. You don't find much about electromagnetic fields interacting with humans. In the 60s and the 70s, the Soviet Union had a large number of studies and research results on this topic. In 1982, so described the situation. Proceedings of the listed symposiums and conferences, more than 20 in the 70s, constitute only a small part of the literature that are scattered in various journals and publications. After the publication of the collection of works on the subject, the effect of magnetic fields on biological objects, published by the Scientific Council on Complex Problems, Cybernetics, Academy of Sciences of the USSR, several books and review articles were published. Dozens of dissertations were defended on specific issues of biological activity of magnetic fields. Just wait until we get into the antenna piece, folks, because wireless power charging is coming soon. It's already here with the charging mats that you place your phone on. And they are building systems, and I have patents that I'll show you, that discuss transmitting directed energy to a device while you're using it to charge it, which requires what they call inductive coupling, which is a coupling of a magnetic field to your device. So we're going to take this apart a piece at a time, one piece at a time. There were published a number of bibliographies. In 1978, the second collection of the Scientific Council on Complex Problem Cybernetics was published, entitled as Reactions of Biological Systems to Magnetic Fields. Today, there are more than 4,000 references on biological effects of magnetic field, most of which appeared in the last decade. Approximately half of the publications devoted to the reactions of the nervous system to magnetic fields. In the area of influencing electromagnetic fields on biological objects, several authors point to the application of research results in the form of new weapons in the USA and the Soviet Union. And it says, see citation 67. Over the past years, US researchers have confirmed the possibility of affecting functions of the nervous system by weak electromagnetic fields. We're not even talking strong fields, folks. We're talking about weak electromagnetic fields. As it was previously said by Soviet researchers, electromagnetic fields may cause acoustic hallucinations and reduce the sensitivity of humans and animals to some other stimuli to change the activity of the brain, especially the hypothalamus and the cortex, to break the process of formation processing and information storage in the brain. I think this is a typo. To break the process of information processing and information storage in the brain. These non-specific changes in the central nervous system can serve as a basis for studying the possibilities of the direct influence of electromagnetic frequencies on specific functions of the central nervous system. Moreover, according to various authors, there exist documents that would confirm the development of appropriate hardware in the USSR. The top secret work were supervised by the twice hero of the Soviet Union, Marshal Sawicki. It is said in one of the inquiries related to this invention and stamped by the Institute of Radio Electronics of the USSR's Academy of Sciences. In 1973, the military unit 71592 of the city Novosibirsk established the first installation of Radiosun and conducted pretests. The positive results are reflected in the act of tests of this military unit. According to calculations made in 1974, the generator Radiosun can effectively treat the city of about 100 square kilometer, plunging its inhabitants into a deep sleep, and at a distance of up to 55 kilometers away from the transmitter. Should we take another pause here? Let's take another pause. One kilometer is 0.62 miles. So they had a military unit construct a radio transmitter device, right, next to a city. And according to calculations made in 1974, the generator can effectively treat, and that word is in quotes, treat the city of about 100 square kilometers, so roughly 60 square miles, a city that is 60 square miles, plunging its inhabitants into a deep sleep from a radio transmitter, and at a distance of up to 55 kilometers away from the transmitter, 25 miles away. Other work claimed that the act of testing, in addition to stamps of the military unit and the academic institution, was also signed by academician Kobzarev, and Godik. I want to pause here and go back to this idea of the Radiosun and just understand for a minute, how long have radio broadcast towers and television broadcast towers been around? And this idea of putting everybody into a deep sleep would be like a large amount of power being transmitted out, or a specific type of modulation, that type of a thing. So what I'm getting at is it possible for a moment to conceive that over a period of decades now, things like over-the-air television broadcast could potentially be modulated in ways to induce some altered form of consciousness, to change your brainwaves. Is that possible? And if it's not being done on a consistent basis, is it possible to assume that the United States, or any other country for that matter, who have broadcast radio and broadcast television, could potentially at some point use those transmitters as devices for experimentation? Is it conceivable or possible to think that that could be done once that infrastructure is in place? So we as consumers use it for entertainment or for information or whatever, yet they're still there and they still possess the right hardware characteristics to do things like potentially put the entire city into a deep sleep. I'm just saying, I'm not accusing or anything. I'm just postulating, putting forth this idea that perhaps that these things are possible and perhaps they have been done. And it makes you wonder exactly what types of techniques could theoretically be in use or have been used during things like presidential elections for the last 40 years, 50 years. Or when they want to prosecute a war and something makes national news and takes the news cycle for weeks and weeks and weeks. And over that period of time, there is this slow, deliberate, consistent change that overcomes the entire nation in order to get the entire nation in lockstep. And I'm not saying this happened. I'm just saying, is it conceivable or is it possible? Because when you look at the people who have been in control, if I can think of that, don't you think they could too? And if that is the case, you have crimes against humanity, you have sedition, you have treason, does it get any worse? And what are the implications of that as it relates to the daily decisions you make today? Things like who you're married to, what kind of job you have, what you chose to do or study in school. When you start looking at the sophistication of modern wireless communication today, and this idea of being able to use radio transmitters, antennas, to interact with biology, specifically the nervous system. The implications are far-reaching, and I think for that reason, I don't think we're going to ever get somebody from an official platform going, yeah, this is what's been going on for the last 40 or 50 years, and we're really sorry, but now that you know, we're going to make it all better. I don't think that's going to happen, because people will begin to question the very existence, their very existence, perhaps the very existence of their children. And to try to extrapolate out what that would do to the social fabric and the social stability, the implications are freakishly scary. Because you would have mutiny, you would have anarchy, you could potentially have chaos if that information was disclosed and the rollout was done in such a way to sow division down to the nuclear family level. So 1974, giant transmitters can basically incapacitate an entire city, and it can do it up to like 25 miles away. That was in 1974. Now we all have little transmitters, plugged into our head, applied to our wrist, in our pockets or our bras, and or in our house or our places of work or everywhere we go, in our cars now. The automation is going to put antennas in automated vehicles, and the antennas are going to be everywhere. That's why we're going to spend so much time looking at antennas in the upcoming future. So back to this now that I'm done digressing. Other work claimed that the act of testing, in addition to stamps of the military unit and the academic institution, was also signed by academician Kabarosev and Godek. The use of microwave radiation in the areas of super high frequency and extremely high frequency for impacting the psyche were covered many times in the press. The most well-known fact, the discovery of strange antenna in the office of the president of the Russian Federation, Boris Yeltsin. I think I remember President Trump not occupying the White House for a number of weeks or months when he was first inaugurated. I think I remember that story where he went off to some other place, one of his own properties that happened to have a whole lot of property around it, which means he also vacated Trump Tower. In the early 90s, all headlines reported about this sensational discovery in the media. Yuri Malin confirmed. Experts have concluded that the antenna has been installed to provide psychological impact on the president. Let's digress again for just 1 second. Super high frequency range. Super high frequency. Super high frequency range is between 3 and 30 gigahertz. Super high frequency. Between 3 and 30 gigahertz. We are functioning in those ranges now. Ultra wideband has been cut loose. I believe it's 6 gigahertz to 12 or 15 or to 18 for wideband. The FCC opened that up recently. So that's in the super high frequency range, and all your cell phones are now getting wideband capable antennas and functionality. 3 gigahertz, they transmit cell phone signals at 3 gigahertz, 3.1, I believe, in some bands. You have satellites, radar bands, all of these here. S-band, C-band, X-band, K-band, KU-band, Ka-band. These are going to be made available for 5G, by the way. Frequency range is used for most radar transmitters, wireless local area networks, satellite communications, microwave radio relay links, and on and on and on. All right, so there's super high frequencies. Let's look at extremely high frequency range. Extremely high frequency range is 30 gigahertz to 300 gigahertz. So this is going to be the spectrum that really opens up when 5G comes online. When you look at the high bands for 5G, they're really going to start around 24 gigahertz and go up to around 100 gigahertz. And they're already talking about opening up the 100 up to 300 for other applications. Much of it will be non-regulated at first. And I have shown on this show many times the manipulation of physiology and emotions using extremely high frequency. There's a patent for that. Israel has it. I'll show it to you. Why not? Here's the patent. And this discusses using extremely high frequency radiation to correct disease, to take away things like arthritis and the cold and the flu, and or to induce disease, as well as manipulate your emotions. And this is from Research and Development of Hebrew University in Jerusalem, patented in 2006. And some excerpts out of it. We'll just briefly go through this real quick. It's possible to employ predetermined modulated electromagnetic waves in the millimeter to sub-millimeter wavelength, so 30 gigahertz, right? So that's the low end of extremely high frequency. For therapeutic treatment, 5G will cover the low end band of this. In particular, the predetermined modulated electromagnetic wave, being an extremely high frequency carrier signal, can be modulated by an information signal. It can be applied to the skin of a living organism. This predetermined modulated signal, information signal, can include information for modifying the organism, such as a physiological condition or an emotional state. And it says here, in such a case, the amplitude, frequency, or phase modulation functions, right? And when we look at how modern wireless communications are sent, it's done with frequency modulation and amplitude and phase modulation. That's how it's done. And in 5G systems, they're going to add power fields, power modulation, so they can triple, quadruple the amount of users that can be sent information based on the power field. So they can tell one phone to pick up and process information if it is in this part of the power field, or when the power field is at this power level, then that phone gets the information. Another phone that's sitting right next to it, when the power level changes and it falls within its assignment range, then that phone will receive the transmitted information. And what we're going to get with 5G is this ability for an entire ecosystem of antennas to run through a huge range of electromagnetic frequencies while being able to change the amplitude, the phase, and the power field of any of the frequencies they choose to select, as well as converge or overlap more than one beam so that they can create unique fields, whether they be power envelope fields or static electric fields or static magnetic fields. We're building very, very, very sophisticated directed energy systems that, when the right EHF signal, when it's modulated with a particular function, right, a particular modulation function that can be referenced from a database, which this patent also talks about, when that particular modulation recipe is the recipe that has the right information in it, it can do things like send healthy organism information into the nervous system, the spinal cord and the brain of somebody who's sick, to regulate and correct the sick person. So this is a patent here that discusses a medical application using extremely high frequency energy to phase or apply extremely high frequency energy to a biological organism to correct a medical condition and or to correct an emotional state. And I'm saying all this to you simply to illustrate that this can be done with electromagnetic energy, and it's being patented in ways now. So for medical purposes, these types of treatments are possible. So let's get back to the this document here. We've got 20 minutes left, approximately. Generally, the psychotronic super high frequency and extremely high frequency emission represents a topic for separate survey. On the basis of these studies, later in the early 90s, some of the so-called non-lethal weapons have been developed. Although many of the modern generators utilize the source of extremely high frequency waves, it was shown that high penetrating emission has some characteristic properties which differ from electromagnetic radiation. For those who are interested in more detail, a good overview of the research in the 70s and 80s in the area of biological radiation can be found in the book of P. Kneppo and L. Titomir. It should also be noted that the impact of electromagnetic and other non-ionizing radiation on biological objects became a normal research topic, which at the moment doesn't belong to either parapsychology or to unconventional research. So what they're saying here is at some point, electromagnetic effects on biology, including non-ionizing radiation, which is what is legally able to be transmitted according to the FCC, became its own independent research topic. It's no longer encompassed under parapsychology or unconventional research. On the contrary, this topic became increasingly popular in today's scientific landscape, and there are citations here to support that. So, next topic. Instrumental psychotronics. Parapsychology of the 1960s refers primarily to the field of psychology. For example, the members of Dmitriev's commission are well-known psychologists. However, technical aspects of biological radiation in line with Chiroglin's experiments and books of Kaczynski and Vasiliev were also very interesting for the technically oriented scientific community. In 1965, the section of bioinformation was organized by the Moscow's Board of Scientific and Technical Society of Radio Engineering, Electronics, and Telecommunications, chaired by I.M. Kogan. In 1968, the technical section of parapsychology and biointroscopy was organized under the Central Board. It tells you right here, super high frequency and extremely high frequency. So, technical section of parapsychology and biointroscopy was organized under the Central Board, Scientific and Technical Society of the Instrument Making Industry, led by Sergeyev. It seems a breakthrough in unconventional research and its separation from parapsychology is related to the discovery of high penetrating radiation from a non-biological origin. Even in the 30s, it was already known that high penetrating radiation possesses some properties of light and can be handled with prisms and gratings, as well as some properties of the electromagnetic radiation, and can be handled with a variety of screens and mirrors. Before the 70s, Mishkin's ponderomotor forces related to spinning objects and Shizovetsky's Z-rays from Sun emission were two approaches of generating non-biological high-penetrating emission. However, in that time, nobody connected to these early works with performed parapsychological research. The first approach of operator-independent detection of this emission is related to the Cherinsky-Velchor effect, discovered in the 30s and repeated in the 60s and later. This effect is about changes in the metachromasia of the Corynea bacterium several hours prior to the change of sun activities. The second approach was developed by the family Curie. They received a patent in 1949. In 1964, the Book of Curie-Lands appeared, which described the glow effect of objects in the strong electromagnetic field. Interest in the Curie-Land effect in the context of unconventional research emerged later with the development of psychotronics, in particular with the first conference on psychotronics. The third approach of detecting the emissions goes to N.A. Kozyrev and is about a change of the conductivity and mechanical properties in some systems and materials. The first unconventional Khosrow's work had been published in 1958. However, since he was not in the framework of the state programs, his work became known only after death of the scientist in 1983. Thus, the early 70s, several approaches for generating and detecting the high penetrating emissions without human operator were developed. It was only a question of time before somebody started to connect these independent results. This process started in the mid-70s. So figure 6, the family, right? Kirillon, image from this place, some article, and that's A. So this is looks like husband and wife or something like that, the family. And then this B, section B over here, image B, Kirillon's image of a leaf with a cut part. And so what they did is they exposed this thing or applied energy to this thing, and they were able to see it basically illuminate. So yeah, detecting emissions is what this thing is talking about. The first instrumental generators of non-biological high-penetrating generators were created in the 60s by Robert Pavlita in Czechoslovakia. Pavlita's talk at the first international conference on psychotronics caused a fury, and the conference itself was reported in Central Soviet scientific journals of that period. For example, in the journal Science and Technology for 1974, here's what the magazine said. Experiments of Czechoslovak researchers R. Pavlita and D. Kremesky proved the possibility of remote impact to light-moving objects. To enhance the impact, R. Pavlita offered a special device, an accumulator of energy. These accumulators are made of different materials and have different shapes. R. Pavlita found a number of other interesting properties of the investigated energy. Empirically, it's found that seeds of beans irradiated by this kind of energy germinated earlier than usual. The plant itself has evolved significantly faster than the control specimens. R. Pavlita also discovered the accelerated deposition of aqueous suspensions under the influence of bioenergy. For example, if a water contaminated with industrial waste was filled into a container with metal shavings irradiated by such energy, then 12 hours later, the water becomes crystal clear. Furthermore, the chemical analysis shows that this is achieved with a very high degree of water purification. If the same water was in contact with non-irradiated metal shavings, then the effect was not observed. It is also necessary to point out the findings of the Estonian physicist T. Neem. He experimentally confirmed an accelerated deposition of colloidal solutions under the impact of human bioenergy. As the term parapsychology embarrassed Soviet researchers due to the retaliation to inexplicable and mystical phenomena, which was contrary to the spirit of materialistic science in the USSR, the term psychotronics fitted well in the scientific picture of that time and has remained in use. Psychotronics and parapsychology are the same thing. On the contrary, the word psychotronics is not widely accepted by Western parapsychology community. Intelligence services, KGB and DIA, were also interested in the works of R. Pavlita, as published in Citation 83 and reprinted in Citation 84. In 1972, Czech Ministry of Internal Affairs asked the USSR to assist in the investigation of Pavlita's devices. Two representatives from the Academy of Science, Kita Jagorsky and from KGB Y. Azarov, arrived in Czechoslovakia. Kita Jagorsky was a well-known opponent of such phenomenon. It seems this choice was motivated by a two-side policy of the USSR in this area. He later wrote a number of skeptical reports. However, the KGB representative became very interested in these devices. Here is a quote from the book of David Sutter, Age of Delirium, The Decline and Fall of the Soviet Union. They talked about parapsychology and problems of communication. In the end, one that was lower and active said that they are interested in experiments with a plate because they want to get an answer to a very important question. They said they have information that the Czech parapsychologist named Pavlita developed an apparatus for creating a biological field without a human presence, and added that this discovery is of great interest and that they need to find Pavlita. Unfortunately, 2 years ago, he disappeared and they heard nothing about him. When he died, talkative one said he was not buried in the cemetery. We have checked all the cemeteries in Czechoslovakia. Bloch and Horoplono suddenly lost all desire to participate in the experiment because there was only one organization able to check all the cemeteries in Czechoslovakia. Different versions of the generator, serpent images are published with permission of something. So what you have here are these little generators. Look like they're made of metal and they've got some type of uniform shape made out of them. And B and C, right? These bottom two images, generators, serpent, a comment from a modern manufacturer. Well, a modern manufacturer still makes these things. That's nice. And it says the fourth one is the advanced design created by us. The first two samples were made of stainless steel, the third one of titanium, the fourth one of steel. The main difference of the fourth sample, it has complex internal structure associated with our ideas about the geometry of space and its energy properties. Man, this is some crazy stuff. So what I'm getting out of this, right, and I'm not sure, but I'm processing this in real time while I'm reading this to you, is they're able to store or manipulate the energy, and energy basically being in the form of a particle and a wave, right? Photons of some type, light or radiation of some type. They could put it in this chamber, store it in this chamber, and then based on like the way that this chamber is made, they're able to manipulate this energy or store this energy or something. And first thing that comes to mind for me is, why are we still using petroleum-based medicine if they've for 100 years now have been working on bioenergy and being able to generate bioenergy artificially? And that's not even including, right, electromagnetic radiation transmissions like we understand them, like Wi-Fi and cell phones and television broadcasts and stuff like that. So anyway, I don't know how much, oh man, we're only halfway through this document. That's crazy. Give me a 1 in chat if you want me to continue reading this in the next show. To me, this is incredibly interesting. So I'm hoping that you guys agree, but we'll continue for the next approximately 10 minutes. As mentioned in citation 87, the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, also indicated interest to Pavlita's work. He has registered many patents. However, the secret of these devices he never opened, and he died in 1991. Awesome. So we can only assume the working principles of his generators based on some interviews. It can be assumed the generators are passive devices that use so-called effect of shapes or effect of forms. We saw a gallery of objects, matte and shiny, rough and smooth, made of steel, bronze, copper, iron, and gold, which were presented to us as psychotronic generators. Chat, you're awesome. You guys are awesome. Thank you. Mystery generators claimed by Pavlita lies in their form. Important is also the material from which they are made. A position and shape of the material which they are made from are able to cause the desired effect. If the generator is designed properly, as claimed by Pavlita, it is able to accumulate bioenergy from all living things, animals, plants, and humans, and then release it outside. Dude, that's just that's insane. It's wonderful. It's beautiful, and it's kind of scary all at the same time. It's just wow. So in the USSR, the first works of that time on the device-based generators were made by Berzdys Skavinsky. His generators Serpan, as shown in Figure 7, are a passive device. The exact structure is unknown. Both Berzdys Stravotsky and R. Pavlita feared unethical uses of their devices. According to some researchers, testing and verifying the work of these generators was controlled at the level of the Central Committee of the CPSU. So what they're saying there is this stuff was super secret squirrel shit. Like it, yeah. No wonder these people disappeared and, you know, all that. This is bananas if this is real. So from 1980 to 2003, works of the 80s and early 90s are primarily characterized by an appearance of centralized strategic programs at the level of the State Committee for Science and Technology at the Council of Ministers. The role of the SCST USSR was to determine the main direction of the development of science and technology, planning and organization of the major developments of national importance for scientific and technical problems. The organization and introduction into production of discoveries, inventions, and the results of exploratory research. So this is a central, I don't know, what do you want to call it, Politburo, if you will, that basically regulated the direction of science and engineering. Is what I'm getting out of this. Thus, the strategic role of some unconventional areas, including instrumental psychotronics, were recognized. These works also received a significant amount of funding. Selection of 1980, early 80s, as the last period in the development of unconventional research is motivated by the following reasons. First, the instrumental generators of the mid-70s have been improved, and the first experimental results of their work are obtained in the 80s, as shown in Figure 8 for generators of Berzdys Stakovsky. Most of these works with this generator were made in Kiev. In general, Kiev during this period was one of the main centers of instrumental psychotronics. V.A. Sokolova describes experiments that were carried out in 1984 through 1987, which were supervised by the USSR's Ministry of Health and Ministry of Agriculture, which took an interest in the Ministry of Defense. Let's look at this Figure 8 here real quick. And it says here, experiments carried out with the Serpan. So that's that device that collected the bioenergy. 1981, impact on human blood in vitro. So that's in like a test tube. And 1980, 1981, impact on drought and frost resisting ability of plants. Impact the nucleus level. Impact on plant germination. Impact on drinking water. Impact on photosynthesis in plants, impact on plant characteristics, investigation of impact nature, comparative analysis of human and device impact, impact on snail neurons, those would be snail brains or snail nervous system, impact on bioinformational taxis, interesting. Impact on animal resistance to ionizing radiation. Whoa. And that was from Moscow Aviation and Space Medicine. Impact on human blood in vitro. Clinical immunology. Survey of experiments conducted with the generator from 1981 to 1990. Works with torsion generators are mainly performed on the basis of biophysical laboratory of the Patrice Lumumba's University in the period from 1984 to 1987. In addition, our torsion generators have been tested in Moscow's leading institutions, the Institute of Virology, of Academy of Medical Sciences, Institute of Bioengineering, at the Gamals Institute of Pharmacological Institute. Interesting. NPO, Volnum, NPO of Engineering Institute of Crystallography, etc. Moreover, our team and generators are tested in a production environment in some farms of the Moscow area, cattle farm, Kamenika and Poldosk district, plant growing on state farms, and the farm Teraskovsky in the Pushkin area. With us at the farm, Istra worked. It's actually amazing, really. So amazing. As a part of these experiments, various virological, biological, medical, and agricultural works were carried out. The objects of these experiments were microorganisms, mice, plants, and even medical works with patients. According to Sokolova, already in 1986, more than 30 torsion generators were produced. Second, due to contacts between authorities and psychics, it is assumed there existed contacts between Wana and Baranev. Various research institutes received official orders to explore these phenomena. In 1980, the SCST and the Presidium of the USSR's Academy of Sciences commissioned the Institute of Radio Engineering and Electronics, ASUSSR, the lead agency of the Academy of Sciences, to study weak signals. The program of studying physical fields from biological objects in order to create fundamentally new methods of medical diagnostics. In particular, it included a study of physical fields from Davyshvili. These works were carried out under supervision of Gulayev and Godek. Name of Gulayev is closely linked with other two names, Kabazarev and Kulagina. The group of academics, Gulayev and Kabazarev, investigated the phenomenon of Kulagina, which has been studied since 1977 in the St. Petersburg Institute of Fine Mechanics and Optics, where we met the name of G.N. Dulanev. These works stimulated development of a psychic line of Soviet parapsychology. Third, in the 70s and 80s, the United States had a number of programs in the fields of applied parapsychology and psychotronics. The first, declassified in 1995, and therefore the most well-known state program of studying PSI phenomena, is the program on clairvoyance, non-local perception. Experts believe that there are actually a few independent programs in the CIA, counterintelligence, naval, and air forces. Two of them are the most famous. The first one was held on the CIA initiative since the early 1970s, since 1989, in SRI International, formerly known as the Stanford Research Institute, and then from 1992 to 1994 at the SAIC, Science Applications International Corporation, and later known as the Anomalous Mental Phenomena. The second program, known by various names, Stargate, was conducted under the auspices of counterintelligence. There are different opinions about these programs, although the CIA declassified 80,000 pages of text. In Russia, there are several books on this subject, such as the work of J.M. Mik Mongolia, Secrets of Remote Viewing. We will stop here, folks, and continue on in a little while.